the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday night. Hope everybody's having a good start of their week. Back to work after the weekend, and hope all is well. All right, today we're gonna do a part two of what we started yesterday. Yesterday, if you remember, we were talking about stakeholder capitalism, and we were talking about so-called stakeholder capitalism. We were talking about corporate social responsibility, and we started talking about ESG, kind of building up towards ESG, and today we're gonna kind of wrap up the discussion by discussing directly and focusing on the whole ESG agenda movement and the response to that. So that's going to be the topic for today. And then we also have a show tomorrow. We'll be doing a show on, we'll see. I'll let you know. Just so you know, I just looked at the news, happened to pick up on Twitter and then looked at the news. The breaking news right now is that the FBI is searching Donald Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago. So I guess they've got a warrant and they are searching the home. Don't know what they're searching for. Maybe some White House files that he didn't put in the right place. I don't know, but the FBI is actually searching Donald Trump's home. This could be, as some people on Twitter suggest, this could be just horrific. This is the Justice Department going after a political rival and somebody who might be running for president in 2024 and going after him. That could be one spin on it. An alternative perspective on it is, if one of us had done what he had done, would anybody hesitate to search our homes? I don't know, because I don't know what they're searching for. I don't know why they're searching, what they're looking for. But, nobody's going to get all riled up because they search another American's home. So don't we have equal treatment before the law, even if you're a former president and maybe a future presidential candidate? But this is going to be huge because this will be completely politicized. This will be the facts around whatever the Justice Department is doing are almost irrelevant to the spin that is going to be created around this. The spin from the left that Trump is a criminal, and the spin from the right that that this is just one big conspiracy theory. One more attempt to go after Trump and to destroy him. So life is nonstop, interesting stuff happening to shake our world and to create a lot of angst, particularly for those who live on Twitter. All right, one other thing I thought I'd share with you before we jump into ESG. I often kind of keep track of what causes subscriptions to decline on the Yaron Brook Show. I find it interesting, and so I kind of pay attention to that. And I've told you before, if I talk too positively about immigration, if I the whole abortion issue caused subscriptions to go down. Certainly Trump. When I go on one of my scathing attacks on Trump, subscriptions go down. Those are the kind of issues that get people really riled up and get people really excited, and so much so that they make the effort of actually unsubscribing to the channel. Well, a couple of days ago, the last couple of days, we've seen not a huge, but definitely a net negative subscription rate, which means, because I get subscriptions, but the unsubscribers defeated the subscribers, right? It went negative. which is unusual, so I pay attention. So I wondered, what did I do? What did I say? What have I done to offend the Iran Book Show subscriber base? And it turns out that what I did was that I argued and presented evidence and facts and both theory and empirical data to suggest that the Russian economy was not doing well. And that goes against the dogma. That goes against what you're supposed to think if you're in a certain tribe or in a certain group or have a certain perspective on life. You can't argue that Russia that's just mainstream media you're on. That's just you buying into the leftist agenda again. You're just being snookered by Ukrainian propaganda. But it's impossible. It's impossible. Not that anybody suggested and given me any facts, but it's impossible for the Russian economy to be doing badly right now. That just can't happen. So people are so offended by the fact that I would suggest that because Russia is not a capitalist country, because Russia is a crony country, because Russia doesn't have a diversified economy, is completely reliant on natural resources, that its economy is suffering. That is unacceptable to people who claim that they are pro-capitalism and pro-freedom. Anyway, just thought I'd share that. It's an interesting tidbit from kind of the happenings on the Iran Book Show. All right, so today we're doing a part 2. I ran out of time yesterday to talk about ESG, so we'll talk more about ESG today. Before we do that, just to remind you that one way you can support the show if you're listening live is to use the Super Chat feature. By the way, if you're not listening live and you're on YouTube, you can click on the applause button and you can make a contribution in the applause. There's no reason you can't participate in the support of the show that happens on YouTube. But if you're live, you can use the Super Chat feature, and you can use the Super Chat feature to ask questions. You can ask questions on pretty much anything, whether I am talking about it on the show today or not. So wide open to anything that you want to discuss, debate, bring up. So do that. We do have a goal for the Super Chat for every evening, for every show, really, whether it's evening or during the day. And that goal is $650. And we usually, I'd say 80 to 90% of the time, make it. We make the goal, particularly when Catherine is on board and cheering you guys on. And Catherine indeed is on board. $20 questions get priority. $20 above questions get priority. And we appreciate questions from anybody at any amount of money. So thank you all. And all right, so let's jump in. So we talked yesterday about stakeholder theory. We talked about corporate social responsibility and how this is an attempt to get corporations to, in a sense, pay less attention to profit, to shareholder wealth maximization, to the owners of the company, and to bring in a utilitarian moral framework into how they think about their business. So instead of a property rights perspective, a perspective that views shareholders as the owners and their wealth, they're basically running the company. You're running it for them. As a manager, you are fiduciary. You are being hired by the owners to run the business for them, and your job is to maximize their long-term wealth. Instead of that perspective, which has been the perspective historically, but certainly since the 1970s to 1980s, that has been the perspective. The idea has been we want to water that down, we want to mitigate that, and what we want to make sure is that we do a kind of a utilitarian perspective. Yes, shareholders are important, but they're only one group, there are many groups, and what we should do is have some kind of utility function in which we try to maximize or we try to benefit everybody, so everybody is happy. I talked about the fact yesterday that is like all utilitarian fantasies. That is a fantasy. It's just both immoral and impractical. It cannot be done. All it does is cripple managers. All it does is it makes them unable to actually function and actually maximize shareholder wealth and maximize profit and actually run the business in a way that is sustainable in the sense of profitable. Profits are the most sustainable thing you do, because profits are something you can apply back into the business to keep it going and to invest and to grow and to innovate and to keep up with your competitors. So profits are what sustains a business, not some floating abstraction called sustainability. So all this is an attempt really to undermine the individualist property rights basis of a market economy, of a capitalist economy, to undermine the individualistic, the property rights perspective of business and the way business should function. And for the most part, the whole stakeholder stuff and social responsibility has not been successful. And as part of constantly trying to reframe the debate, constantly trying to figure out how to have an impact, how to be successful, they constantly change the name and they constantly change the strategy and they constantly change their approach. And as we discussed yesterday, the most recent framing of the discussion has been around something they call ESG, environment, society, governance. And here they take all that stakeholder theory and they boil it down to what they seemingly really care about. Environment, which is really, in the world in which we live today, really all boiled down to climate change. That's all they seem to care about. And climate change boils down to the evil of carbon emissions. That's all they seem to care about. S is kind of a catch-all but primarily for issues around, quote, equity, or really around inequality, but not inequality of outcome. And G is around governance, around the leadership of the business, around the kind of board of directors that a business has. And again, these are all issues that have been with us forever. They're all issues that were framed around social responsibility and stakeholders, but now they've narrowed in on ESG as the framework in which these will be discussed. I'll give you a quick example of a G, of the governance side of it. For a long, long time, there's been this debate about who should be a board member. And during the 80s and 90s, there was a big push to get more women represented on the board. And that boards were male-dominated, and there were too many men, and there weren't enough women, and we need to make sure that more women are on the board. And there were all kinds of criteria established that would try to force businesses to get women on the board. We'll talk about how they did that in a minute. But one good example of this, and really a classic, and I encourage everybody to look it up so you could actually read it, is in 1996, Cypress Semiconductor got a letter from a nun, from a nunnery, I guess, a nunnery that that was running their little pension plan for the nuns, and they had a small investment, a very small investment, in Cypress Semiconductor, and they had written a letter to the CEO complaining about the fact that there was no female representation on the board of directors of the company. Of course, in those days, when you said female, they actually knew, or when you said women, you actually knew what you were talking about. I think today you would have to specify, much more in detail in terms of gender and in all of that, and what you meant by female, and what is a woman, what isn't a woman, in order to get the right kind of diversity message across. But in those days, a woman was a woman, and you just said, you don't have enough women on the board. And T.J. Rogers, the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor, not by chance, T.J. Rogers, who was heavily influenced by Ayn Rand, a huge fan of Atlas Shrugged, He wrote a letter back to the nuns. He published that letter in the Wall Street Journal. You can find it. You go to T.J. Rogers' Nuns letter, and you can find the letter. It's definitely worth reading. As I said, it was published in the Wall Street Journal. And he basically made the case that no, I hire people based on merit. I hire board members based on merit. And the fact is that right now, in this point in time, in Silicon Valley, there are very few, if any, women who qualify to sit on the board of directors of Cypress Semiconductor. Not because they're women, just as a fact in terms of qualification. Once there is a woman that's qualified, happy to put her on the board of directors. There's no effort to discriminate against her, against women. The effort is to get the best people on the board of directors, the people who can best benefit shareholders, who can best represent shareholders, and can therefore best help the CEO, me, maximize shareholder wealth. It's a beautiful letter. It's very well written. I encourage you to read it. It's the kind of thing that if CEOs, and I'll read you some other stuff of CEOs that are standing up to this nonsense. But if we had a significant number of CEOs in America, God forbid a majority of CEOs in America, making these kind of statements, the whole ESG movement would be dead, and the whole woke stuff would disappear. T.J. Rogers was a lone voice back then. There have been some lone voices here and there over the years, but almost nothing. Almost nothing. So how did they actually try to impose these kind of put pressure on businesses to include, for example, women on the board and what they perceived as good governance on the board? Well, a big part of this was done by two of the largest at the time, largest institutional investors in the world. One was CalPERS and one is CalSTRS. These are the two California pension plans. One is of the Teachers Union and one of Public Employees of California. These are very, very large pension plans. They have a lot of money. They invest across the board in stocks, in lots of different things, but in venture capital funds and in real estate, across the board. But they invest a lot in individual stocks and individual companies. And of course, these are not primarily economic entities. They're not primarily managed for the benefit of the pensioners. Sadly, they are primarily political entities. And you can tell they're political by the fact that the governor of the state of California is one of the board members on CalPERS and CalSTRS, even though he knows nothing about finance. I think that's pretty much a given, that the governor of California knows nothing about finance. I don't think that's controversial. So CalPERS and CalSTRS went to companies that they owned a significant amount of stock in and said, you better put more women on the board or we will vote against you in shareholder meetings once a year in the proxies. Now, this, I believe, violates their fiduciary duty to their pensioners, but the pensioners haven't done anything about it. They haven't sued. They haven't done anything, so be it, right? So they went around and insisted on changing the boards of directors and governance of companies. They rarely had a huge amount of success because ultimately, even though they're massive investors, they don't come close to having 50% of any particular company. They often would get some other companies together with them, but they had only partial success. I'll give you one example of how ludicrous this got. One of the theories that good governance is supposed to invoke, or good governance is supposed to be, is that every board of directors should have what are called outside directors. And there's a really good reason for this, right? I'm a big proponent of outside directors, and outside directors add huge value to the company under certain conditions. Now, what are outside directors? Outside directors are directors who are not employees of the company. They're not people who directly benefit salary-wise, or are not contractors of the company, or don't have family members who are contractors or employees of the company. In other words, people who can give you a fresh perspective. They're not part of management. They're not part of the culture of the company. They're outsiders. Okay. And that's great. That is a real value, right? But what kind of outsiders would be particularly good? Well, in my world, what particularly good outsiders would be people who are not part of management, people who are not part of the culture of the company, people who do not benefit directly from the company, but they should be people who own stock in the company. Indeed, if I was running a company, I would require all my board members to own shares because I want them to care about the success of the company. How can they represent shareholders when they are not shareholders? So ideally, a board of directors is filled with people who own shares, who are unbelievably knowledgeable about business, but who have no family or other direct relationship to the CEO and to other people in the company. That's a fantastic board. Those are great board members. So, for example, somebody like Warren Buffett is a great board member to have. Warren Buffett, sat for many years, maybe still does, I don't know, on the board of Coca-Cola. He was a big investor in Coca-Cola, made a lot of money off of his investment in Coca-Cola, was a big investor. Warren Buffett is a smart guy, knows a lot about business, has seen cycles, gone up and down. He would be great if you're a CEO to have on your board as an advisor, as somebody who can, and as a shareholder. If I owned Coca-Cola stock, I would say, cool, Warren Buffett's on the board, that's great. The CEO has this great advisor, but also Warren Buffett owns a lot of shares in Coca-Cola. So he has the same incentives I do. He wants to maximize shareholder wealth, which means maximizing his wealth, which means maximizing my wealth. This is, again, the beauty of capitalism. This is the beauty of individualism. This is the beauty of a system of property rights and individualism, that interests are aligned. Warren Buffett's interest as a shareholder are aligned with my interest as a shareholder, hopefully aligned with the CEO's interests of a shareholder. And that's a great board. Well, I can't remember the year this happened. It must have been in the 1990s. CalPERS, the pension plan for the teachers union, objected to Warren Buffett being a board member. Because from their perspective, he wasn't an outsider. They didn't count him as an outsider. Why? Because he owned shares. So for CalPERS, and I think many of these ESG people, the governance, the G, not only does it mean diversity, and today that diversity is nutty, but it also means, quote, outside directors, meaning people who don't have any interest in the company. They don't own shares. I mean, ideally for them, an outside director is somebody who knows nothing about the business. Ideally, an outside director is somebody who comes out from outside of the world of business. Now think about that. From a shareholder's perspective, I don't want a bunch of non-businessmen who don't have an economic stake in the company representing me. The board is supposed to represent me. But you see, the problem with Warren Buffett, the problem with Warren Buffett being a board member is he's too self-interested. He's going to maximize shareholder wealth because he's a shareholder. Isn't that his job? But no, stakeholder, social responsibility, ESG, we don't want people maximizing shareholder wealth. We want them to think about society and think about the world and think about all these other things. So for that, what we need as board members are not shareholders, not people who are going to be self-interested. We need people who don't have a self-interest in the success of the company. What we need are people like, I don't know, university professors, lawyers maybe. Oh, I know, politicians. They're the former politicians, because they can't while they're in office, but former politicians. That's great because they also bring the knowledge of how to massage Washington. And ideally, we need a community organizer or two. Maybe we can have a lawyer as a community organizer and a former politician. That would bring in the appropriate selflessness, the appropriate social consciousness, whatever the hell that means, the appropriate collectivist attitude onto the board of directors, so that now we can feel secure that management, the CEO, won't try to maximize shareholder wealth, God forbid, even though he's an employee of the shareholder, and that the board represents these shareholders, and that their fiduciary duty as a board is to watch after the interests of shareholders. That's what the G means. That's what the G in ESG means. S means whatever you want it to mean these days, but to a large extent right now, it's over the last 2 years. S means, has the company given any charitable contributions to Black Lives Matter? The S means, does the corporation have a robust DEI, diversity, inclusiveness, equity, inclusiveness program? How often does it bring Kendi X in to talk about anti-racism? Right? Those are the things that now fall under S, and corporations are ranked and how inclusive they are and how much they try to get their employees to be inclusive, how many programs they do, how many boring seminars they put them through. And then, as I said, E is climate change. How committed are they to reducing their carbon footprint in the world? Now, ESG, which was launched sometime in the late 2000s and got, I think, a boost from the financial crisis, a period where capitalism was in retreat, business was in retreat, business was apologetic. It came into the 20-teens. ESG and the whole stakeholder social responsibility thing basically got their first big, really big win. What is it now? 3 years ago in 2019. Because for years, they've been chipping away, but to a large extent, so many people ignored them and didn't take them too seriously. Now, politicians would regulate and impose certain things, but the whole point about ESG and these others is to get the corporations to do the stuff voluntarily. So, but they've been chipping away, and as I said, they've been taking over the business schools. They've been educating future leaders. They've been educating future employees. They've been educating board members. Boards have shifted. They've had some impact on changing the compositions of board of directors. And slowly and inevitably, I think, unfortunately, because we know that ideas drive history, slowly and inevitably, these bad ideas have infiltrated into the boardroom, into CEOs' consciousness, into what is perceived to be moral, right, just, equitable. Business leaders of, I think, post-2008 in particular, fed up with being called greedy, fed up with being called selfish, and they're slowly being chipped away. It took like 30, 40 years. But in 2019, the Business Roundtable, which is an organization that represents the largest corporations in America, I can't remember the number, but a significant number of the largest businesses in America. They get together regularly, they do seminars, the Business Roundtable lobbies on behalf of big business in Washington. It is their voice, it is their representation. And the CEOs of the largest businesses in America get together at the Business Roundtable, once a year to discuss, what are the big issues, what they should do. And in 2019, they made a statement that will go down in history as one of the most damaging, horrific statements ever. But they basically made a statement where they affirmed that the primary responsibility was not to maximize shareholder wealth. That they indeed were committed to some kind of maximization of stakeholder benefits. That they were abandoning the idea, self-interested, profit-based, property rights-based idea that and I think their fiduciary duty, their legal fiduciary duty, they were abandoning that in the name of stakeholders, in a sense in the name of ESG. It was a shock, but inevitable, unsurprising in a sense, once you thought about it. Basically, what had happened was that they had succumbed because they did not have the moral fortitude. They did not even have the moral language, or the moral, certainly not the moral certainty, or the moral theory, or the confidence in capitalism or in property rights or in the system of property rights to stand up for their shareholders, to stand up for their commitment to profitability, to stand up for their commitment to maximizing long-term profits, long-term economic profits, long-term shareholder wealth. They abandoned all that under pressure, not political pressure. Remember, this is Republicans, Trump, whatever. It wasn't political pressure. Social, moral, ideological pressure. And since then, I think ESG has become much more popular, much more common. In 2020, BlackRock, the largest institutional investor in the world today, I think, bigger than CalPERS and CalSTRS, they run your 401k, they run a lot of the ETFs out there, they run all kinds of mutual funds, managed portfolios. They are the biggest investor, I think, in the world. BlackRock came out and said that they were now going to, as a part of their investment process, going to give companies, in a sense, an ESG score, evaluate companies based on their ESG, and determine how to invest in them based on ESG. They also launched a bunch of ESG-related products. These are funds that invest only in ESG companies. By the way, which is a trend that goes back again to the 1990s. I think the first socially responsible fund was raised in 1990. Mutual fund, if you wanted to invest in socially responsible companies. No, for example, gun companies, no oil companies, no, none of those. None of those companies deemed by the authorities, whoever the authority happened to be unwanted. You could invest. Now there are dozens of ESG funds, mutual funds, all kinds of funds, hedge funds. A bunch of funds have called themselves, have defined themselves as ESG. ESG has become this massive marketing, you could call it a marketing gimmick, if you will. It's interesting. Let me just see if I can find this. ESG has become big business. So there's $2.77 trillion. That's T, $2.77 trillion in global sustainable fund assets. Right? Now, it turns out that a lot of these funds that call themselves ESG are not ESG enough. In Europe, in May, this is May, what year is this, 2021 or 2022? Not sure. I think it's 2022. In May, police raided the offices, the European offices of Deutsche Bank, of the unit that runs mutual funds. And they're investigating what they're calling greenwashing. That's a new one, greenwashing. Greenwashing means you say your investments are green, ESG, but they're not. So you're committing fraud. So they're saying this is prospectus fraud. In June, I guess this is 2021, in June, the SEC in the United States announced an investigation into Goldman Sachs for claiming some of its funds were sustainable, and ESG, when they really weren't. So ESG has become a brand, but a brand filled with content. This is not just marketing. Now, it is true that most ESG funds look very, very similar to funds that are not ESG. If you look at BlackRock's big ESG funds, they're almost exactly the same as the S&P 500 index fund. Very few differences. But you know what's true about an ESG fund? BlackRock's included, is that they cost investors, you who invested with them, anywhere from 5 to 10 times more in fees so that you can feel good about yourself. And this is the whole thing about ESG. I mean, we'll see some of the bad stuff that ESG is trying to do to companies. But for the most part, ESG investing is a way for investors, us, to feel good about ourselves, to invest in the market, to still profit. We all want to profit. We all want a positive rate of return. But think of ourselves as we've done good today. We've done good today. We invested in sustainable companies. We invested in financial managers who are going to insist that these companies cut their carbon footprint. We did good today. And it makes us, the investors, feel good, right, if we bought into this nonsense about what we've invested in. From a financial perspective, ESGs, particularly this year, have underperformed the indexes. They're very similar to the index. I haven't underperformed them by a lot, by a little bit, but they've still underperformed them. And at the same time, given that they're almost exactly the same as the S&P 500, if you really buy into the evil of capitalism and all this anti-shareholder and anti-profit and anti-business rhetoric, then these funds are not really doing much to help you. So, 4 things about ESG funds. This is from Colorado, University of Colorado professor Sanjay Bhagat in the Harvard Business Review. He says, 1, ESG funds have underperformed. They don't do as well as ordinary funds, as index funds. 2, companies, individual companies that tout their ESG credentials have worse compliance records for labor and environmental rules. So they're just lying, even by their own standards. 3, and we'll get to why that is, ESG scores of companies that signed the UN Principles of Investment, another one of these crazy documents, didn't improve after they signed. And financial returns were lower for those that signed. And 4, companies publicly embrace ESG as a cover for poor business performance. Now, this all makes sense. If you remember the exercise we ran about what happens when you have stakeholders, you can't run the business well. You can't run the business properly without having a focus, without knowing whose well-being you're trying to maximize. And as we talked about, good managers who are targeting maximizing long-term shareholder wealth know that to do that, they have to treat their employees well. They have to have good relationship with the community in which they function. They can't be massive polluters. There are lawsuits, and not only lawsuits, they live in the community they're going to pollute. Their employees live in the community they're going to pollute. Their shareholders live in the community they're going to pollute. It's not in their self-interest to kill themselves. They have to be good to their suppliers, their bondholders, to all their stakeholders. But all of that it's not good no matter what. It's good because treating you well maximizes shareholder wealth. We're going to treat you well because treating you well maximizes long-term economic profits. That's what good managers do. That's what good managers focused on maximizing shareholder wealth do. But if you don't have that focus, then it's very hard for you to run a business effectively. It's very hard for you to run a business properly. I mean, we talked about, I think, last time, how did we get the shale revolution? From single-minded, focused businesses devoting resources, energy, time, capital, risk-taking to figuring out fracking, and then executing, and then finding new places in which to frack, moving out of North Dakota and finding other places where you could frack, making it more and more and more efficient, driving the cost down, 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 so that the natural gas coming out is not that expensive. And that changed the world. It didn't change the world because the people doing it, and by the way, it reduced carbon emissions, if you care about that, right? Reduced carbon emission because natural gas is a lot, I don't like to say cleaner. Natural gas emits less CO2 when turned into electricity than does coal, for example. And natural gas was replacing coal. So it had the impact that the environmentalists would like. Not because anybody went into this field wanting to reduce CO2 emissions. They went into the field with the sole purpose of solving a problem and making money, of providing more carbon fuels for the world so that they could make money for their shareholders. I showed you the graph last time of the fact that when companies focus on maximizing shareholder wealth, when we have free markets, when we respect property rights, what do we get? We get cleanliness, clean streets, clean water, clean air. We get wealth. Wealthy people spend money to clean stuff up. You know who can't clean their environment up? Poor people. Therefore, poor countries are relatively filthy. Why? Because they don't have money to clean them. And when they produce electricity, they can't put all the filters in that clean out all the pollutants. When they produce stuff, they burn wood, they burn coal, they burn stuff. It pollutes, puts stuff, all kinds of stuff into the air. Poverty pollutes. Wealth is clean. How do you get wealthy? With cheap energy. With companies focused on maximizing shareholder wealth, with companies focused, or a system focused on property rights. Yeah, I mean, Jennifer reminds me, when the Berlin Wall fell, one of the things that was so stark, not just between East and West Berlin, but between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, was just how filthy and poor communism was. Capitalism, with all the industrialization, and with all the stories about pollution, was like a gazillion times cleaner than the communists were. And a lot of that just had to do, beyond the fact that everything's communally owned, so nobody cares about it, but it also has to do with the fact that they're poor. When you're poor, you don't have the time, the energy, the resources to clean. To clean costs money. So ESG has grown a lot over the last 3 years. I actually think now it's on decline. I think partially the authorities, the SEC is clamping down on people claiming to be ESG when they're not. I think there are more and more articles out there pointing out how corrupt ESG is by its own standards. What isn't happening yet is enough CEOs standing up and defending themselves and defending their own actions, their own practices, when it comes to hiring, their own practices when it comes to the environment, in practices when it comes to governance. So I want to show you an example from one CEO who's done this. This is again from Bud Brigham, the chairman of Atlas Sands, and it's from a letter he wrote about who we are. And let me just share the screen. There it is. Okay. So this is an excerpt from who we are, chairman's letter for Atlas Sand. This is about the S. Let me just lower this down a little bit. Whoops. How do we do that? There we go. This is about the S. The S is social, ESG. Well, he says, we hire 100% based on merit, seeking individuals to further our mission. We do not hire based on race or gender. As Dr. Martin Luther King stated, people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now that's the way to deal with ESG. It's a way to make a stand, a positive stand about what you do and what you do care about and what values you actually are upholding. It continues, therefore, we reject the practice of grading firms based on race or gender metrics, and we do not take such ranking into account when making business decisions. In hiring, we do seek individuals with excellent character, appropriate, diverse, and complementary skills, backgrounds, and perspectives that add value in performance and culture towards the achievement of our mission. So don't even let them get away with owning the word diversity. What you really want is a diverse set of skills. What you really want is a diverse set of people with different backgrounds who bring a more interesting culture, who might bring a different perspective to the issue of problem solving. That doesn't involve skin color, doesn't involve gender, doesn't involve ethnicity. It involves who they are as individuals. Those are the kind of statements we need to see from CEOs if we're going to combat the ESG phenomenon. Let me show you the next slide. This is the way, this is Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Oilfield Services. Notice that a lot of these CEOs are from the better CEOs, the CEOs that are standing up, are from the oil and gas industry. I think there are two reasons for that. One is it's an industry that is particularly being abused by ESG because of the E, because of climate change. So they are particularly being under attack. I think ESG, just to give you one sense in which ESG has done real damage, I think a lot of companies are hesitant to drill. I think a lot of financiers are hesitant to invest in new drilling because of the Biden administration's war on fossil fuels, because they want to shrink production in the United States. Why would I invest in something long-term if long-term it's in danger? A lot of funds are saying, wait a minute, if I want to get a good ESG score, I shouldn't invest in oil and gas production because that'll lower my ESG score. I think some of that is being reversed. I think some of that is people are calling on it. But it's been an issue. It's why I think we have underproduction in the oil and gas fields right now, one of the reasons. So here's, that's one reason, is they're particularly under attack. The second reason why you get, I think, better CEOs attuned to this in the oil and gas is the work Alex Epstein's done. I mean, give him credit. And now that he's come out so strongly, there's a bunch of other intellectuals who picked up the mantle. And so now there's a real army of intellectuals out there that really going after ESG, really going after and defending companies. And what this does is it gives CEOs the language, the terminology, the confidence, the moral certainty to stand up for themselves. Because they have, and this is the role of the intellectual, this is the role, this is the joint role of the intellectual and the businessman together. They have now the intellectual behind them. They have the intellectual who can give them the moral certainty. Give them the intellectual backbone, if you will. And that's so crucial. That's why we need intellectuals out there doing this kind of work. That's why the work that Alex is doing is so important, and we need thousands of them, of Alexes. So this is Chris Wright. He writes, "It is simply not possible to discuss the environmental and social impacts of our industry without considering the environmental and human impacts of the absence of our industry. What would happen in the world if we stopped producing? The progress in the human condition leading to the modern world was enabled by the surge in plentiful, affordable energy." And what he's not saying is that we supplied. That we supplied. So this is the consequence of real intellectual work and these CEOs having the courage and having now the intellectual ammunition to go after them. And then finally, and I think this is Bud's word, what does he think of ESG? ESG, stakeholder capitalism, and conscious capitalism. We didn't talk explicitly about conscious capitalism. Conscious capitalism is what the CEO of Whole Foods is pushing. I debated him on a couple of occasions around this. ESG, stakeholder capitalism, conscious capitalism are all veiled attacks on private property rights and economic liberty. They are campaigns to co-opt or take control of commercial enterprise from the owners. More of it is likely illegal. Much of it is likely illegal. All of it is immoral. Ultimately, it's socialism. To the degree the movements are successful will be the degree that human flourishing will be diminished. So that's the kind of stand we need to take. That's the kind of stand businessmen need to take in order to defeat ESG. This is an intellectual battle. Business plays an incredibly important role in shaping our culture. I've talked about the positive of this. I did this in my talks about optimism. I often talk about this, the fact that people get out of school with all the garbage they are taught, they go to work. It's not the fact that they pay taxes that changes them. It's the fact that they have deadlines to meet. It's a fact that their wishes don't count anymore. It's a fact that there's a bottom line. It's a fact that there's performance expectations. It's a fact that they have to deal with reality and with other people who don't agree with them. They have to go out there and make a sale. They have to find the budget. They have to write up a budget. They have to live to the budget. They have to work. There's work to be done. And work is connected to reality directly. There are lines of code to be written. There's a deadline to be met. That's reality clashing with everything they learned at university. And it's exactly what people need and what brings them back to being decent. But what we're seeing now is with ESG and with DEI is the corruption of the workplace. The attempt to corrupt and to undermine and to instill habits in workers that are detached from reality, that are anti-profit, that are anti-success. And ESG is part of that. ESG is trying to change the world by changing business, by changing businesses' priorities, by changing businesses' focus, by changing businesses' investments, by changing businesses' approaches. And the fact that people like Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, buy into this, or that the Business Roundtable buy into it, is a disgrace. I mean, that should be, anybody who signed that declaration by the Business Roundtable should be fired. It is a true disgrace. And things like that will do more to undermine capitalism than anything that government can do. But luckily, because it's voluntary, because it's a market, And because ultimately shareholders want to make money, and so do many CEOs, and so do many employees, ultimately, I think there's resistance to full-fledged embracing of suicide. And so I think there'll be a backlash against this. I think we're seeing the beginnings of it. Larry Fink, more recently, because of the financial trouble, because the stock market's down, because of COVID, because of all these things, Larry Fink himself has been saying, well, you know, maybe we should be a little less serious about ESG. Anyway, that's what I have to say. Hopefully you enjoyed that and learned something from it. Let me make a quick pitch for the super fund. For the super funds here, let me just say, you know, these shows, I just spent 2 hours talking about stakeholder theory and social responsibility and ESG. There are not a lot of people out there in the pundit, I don't know, what do you call it, public intellectual, YouTube personality, whatever, world that devote detail shows that go into detail like this about these issues, that provide you with a philosophical context for them, that provide you with intellectual ammunition to defeat them. You know, I've done shows on that go into the detail on the on this stupid inflation act, right? That is going to be inflationary, not anti-inflationary. I take these issues and we really dig deep and go into a lot of detail on it. And if you appreciate that, in other words, if you appreciate what I do, if you appreciate the kind of effort that goes into putting these, the kind of knowledge that goes into it, if you appreciate the material being supplied to you, the listener out there, then please show your support to Yaron Brook Show by using the super chat to contribute, or by upping your monthly contribution. You could, you know, can you increase it by 25%? Is that possible? Would that work? David said, he says, I appreciate you on GB News. Yeah, I mean, nobody's paying me to go on GB News, but you guys make it possible for me to go on GB News. I go on GB News, and in a sense, you're paying me, particularly those of you who are making monthly contributions and therefore paying for all of my activities under this umbrella. So please continue to do so. Please consider raising your contributions by 10 or 25% if you can. Please consider making more Super Chat contributions here. We are way, way, way off our goal, and I'm sure Catherine is pretty unhappy down there for us not being close to our goal. So we're about $450 short of our $650 goal. So Catherine has her work cut out for her to bring us back. Don't make it so that you know that the shows that do really, really well, or the both in terms of viewers and in terms of money we raise, are the ones that are the most depressing. These are the kind of shows that are more educational, that we really dig into a topic like this, are the ones that I think are the most valuable, and hopefully you do too, and hopefully you should show your support for these kind of shows by clicking the Super Chat button and making a contribution. All right. Let's see. We have a bunch of super chatters, and we will take them on. Liam, let me just do this. Let me do that. Let me then do this. Liam asks, is there recognition of the necessity of markets from intellectuals today compared to 50 years ago? Even if they're not pro-market, they realize markets are a necessity. Or are they still on a primarily nihilistic bent of tear it all down? I mean, it really depends on which intellectuals you're talking about. There's certainly a bunch of intellectuals, maybe more than ever, outside of economics, maybe even outside of political science, but certainly in the feminist, in the, ethnic studies, probably English and all kinds of other fields, that are as eager to tear stuff down as anybody has ever been, and there are more of them, I think, than ever have been. I think in realms that get closer to reality, certainly business schools, economics, political science, and other fields like that, you get people who are more connected to reality. And you still get a leftist mentality. You still get an anti-free market mentality. But almost nobody out there is anti-markets as they see it, right? As long as you regulate them and control them and take out what they consider the abuses of them. So, for example, the Marxists complain constantly that they're treated badly, that nobody takes them seriously, and it's true. Nobody does. Because they're full of it, right? Because people who are completely anti-markets are not taken seriously in the world in which we live, not by anybody who has any connection to reality. Now, people who say, no, I believe in markets, but they should be heavily regulated, controlled, and maybe a little bit of central planning, all in the name of American interests, or in the name of helping the poor, or whatever. Then people go, yeah, I agree with that. But if you say we should abolish markets, oh no, that's communism, that's socialism, we don't believe in any of that. But if you just want to regulate them, then people are fine with it. So I think there's a huge recognition that you need markets, you need these transactions to happen, you need pricing mechanisms. There's a discomfort around that, and therefore they want to control it as much as possible, regulate it as much as possible. But they're not quite brave enough to say we can do without markets. So they want the pretense of capitalism, the pretense of private property, the pretense of liberty and freedom. That's what they want. And then they're okay. But if you actually call them, if you actually name you're against private property, oh no, absolutely not. I mean, I'm not talking about the real socialist. I'm talking about the kind of the mainstream left and right. Oh, you want everything to be central planned. No, just a little bit of central planning. We don't want everything to be central planned. They want to pretend that they're capitalists. All right, let's see. Trevor, just chipping in to support. Happy that you're covering the topic of ESG grid analysis. Thank you, Trevor. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me how there's not a huge amount of interest in these kind of topics, right? Thank you, MJ Davis and Triple C. Like when I did like the tax on stock buybacks, it's like I don't get a sense that people get excited about that. I'm curious. I don't even know if Christian's going to make a short video of it, but if he does, how many people watch it? My guess is not many. Even though it's like super relevant to your life. It's super important. But the fact is, right now in the world in which we live, ESG, taxes on capital, what the government is doing, people don't seem to get excited by it. They don't care. But you misgender somebody on the left, or you dare to say something sympathetic about transgenders on the right, I don't know, people flip out. They go nuts, even though the whole issue of transgenderism has almost no impact on almost anybody. But the culture, what's called the cultural issues, dominate, even though they are, in terms of impact on our lives, far smaller than the economic issues. But there's no energy. I mean, I sense that, and it's unfortunate because, of course, my strengths are the economic stuff. But I sense it. Nobody gets excited by me doing a show on some economic issue that I find fascinating, that I think is super important. But if we're going to talk about cultural stuff, God, people jump all over that. And it's just, for me, it's just weird. All right, let's see. I said all that, and then we got a bunch of people throwing money at me. Again, Triple C and MJ Davis, thank you guys. Let me get Shazbot's song that he wants copied over. I still don't have a mechanism to put song and movie reviews to the side. I have to copy them over. So we've got, what is that song? Tiptoe Through the Tulips by Tiny Tim. Shazbot has the strangest taste in Oh, he wants me to review. Okay, he was just kidding. He doesn't want me to do Tiny Tim. Don't know why. I was all getting excited to do Tiny Tim. He wants me to do a Star Trek episode. All right, I think I owe you already a Star Trek episode, so I owe you 2 Star Trek episodes now. Let's see. Paul Cohen says, great discussion. Thank you, Paul. And then we'll do that. So thank you, Shazbot, for that. Okay, let's see. Where were we? Thomas Schubadam says, I love hearing about this, but I get the feeling that finance business shows aren't big money makers for you. I know, and it's like, this is actually my expertise. And I find this stuff fascinating. I don't know if you can tell. And it's like a downer when I get like no vibe back. Like I'm watching how many people are watching. It's like people are coming in, oh, it's finance, and they're dropping out. And they're coming in, oh, you're talking about one of those financial topics, and they drop out. It's like if I was talking about, first of all, war sells really well. So people like it when I talk about war. But it's the non-economic, non-financial issues that really get people excited. And if I want to get 100,000 followers or subscribers, what I need to do is somehow figure out a crazy position on some cultural issue and really get you guys excited about it. We'll have to invent something. You guys start thinking about what we can do to get us up to 100,000 by pissing off, I don't know, by not pissing off anybody or pissing off everybody, I don't know, but by coming up with one of these issues that we can really take to the cleaners and build a $100,000 subscriber base off of, because there's got to be a way, right? Got to be a way. Without being Alex Jones, without lying through the teeth. Maybe there isn't a way without lying. I don't know. All right, thanks, Thomas. Gail says, stakeholder, schmakeholder, bring back respect for individual creative minds. No kidding. Thank you, Gail. Absolutely. Shazbot, well, Gail said, yes. We all agree with Gail. All right, Thomas Schubata, I appreciate your description of non-American conservatives as less religious than here. Thatcher voted for the bills that decriminalized homosexuality and for the UK abortion rights bill. We need more of those conservatives. We do, but there are very few of them today. There are very few of them. They're a dying breed, non-religious conservatives. Unfortunately, Leonard Peikoff's prediction in the dim hypothesis are really coming true. We're seeing the Republican Party become more religious, not less. We're seeing that, like on this show, the things that get people passionate are issues of culture, issues of religion, issues of so-called values. And that is what gets them excited. And what we're seeing is, look at what's happening with abortion. Look at what's happening with the Supreme Court. Look at the passion with which people engaged in the culture war, and neither side caring about individual rights or individual liberty or individual freedom. Just my view versus your view, and it just really is. I think dim hypothesis is coming real before our eyes. One of the things Leonard says in the book is that in order for dim to become a reality, that is, that you get a authoritarian regime of the right, of the religious right. First, what you have to have is a broad class of intellectuals that are promoting that agenda, that are promoting religious, and the religious right has never had more intellectuals on its side than it does today. And they've never been more explicit about what they want. And we saw this with the National Conservatives when I talked about that. They've never been more explicit about how they're going to get there. They've never been more explicit about the restrictions they're going to place on people, on how authoritarian they want to be. It's right out of the dim hypothesis. It's like right out of that chapter where he talks about how this is going to evolve. First come the intellectuals. First comes the army of intellectuals. And then it's just a question of the right kind of politician with the right kind of charisma to rise out of them. Thanks, Thomas. Let's see. Richard says, will you make any public appearances in Northern California when you're in the state? I'd like to see you speak in person. No, I'm not. I mean, partially because, well, no, almost exclusively because nobody's invited me to come and speak. So I don't really have a good mechanism to get universities to invite me to come and give talks and to come and speak. Come and speak. I'm doing a couple of talks in Ohio in November, but I'd love to come to California and give some talks. We just need to find the right university club or the right organization. Like in the old days, there was a Silicon Valley conservative group, a big Silicon Valley conservative group that used to invite me to speak. I spoke twice there. But I think today, given how anti-Trump I am, they won't invite me. You think only the left cancels, which is complete bullshit. I've been canceled more by the right than by the left. There are a number of people who used to invite me to speak. A number of organizations used to pay me to speak. They don't anymore. And they don't anymore for one obvious reason, and that is I'm anti-Trump. So I've been canceled. I've been canceled by student groups, from Turning Point to YAL to YAF, and I've been canceled by conservative groups. So, yeah, they don't want to hear it. John Wayne asks, people have to claim that what we have is capitalism and that they support it, but ignore that mixed economy means. But hey, it's still capitalism. Yeah, I mean, they want the aura of capitalism. They want the pretense of capitalism. They want to pretend. And they want, I mean, remember, Elizabeth Warren says constantly that she's a capitalist. She believes in capitalism. She supports capitalism. They want that. And of course, everything they believe in undermines. Everything they believe in is not just mixed economy, it's statism, like Elizabeth Warren. But they want the credibility that capitalism still has in the culture. It's still true that Americans generally think capitalism is a good thing. But yes, it's really important for us to be clear that the problems when they happen are not problems that are created by capitalism. They're problems all created by the mixed economy, by what we have around us as a mixed economy. Colleen, what did I do here? Sorry. Colleen says, I really think people are evading their reality by focusing on issues that don't really impact them. They have no values at stake fighting about those issues. I agree with you. I agree with you, and it's bizarre. And you watch it, and it's like strange. Their whole worldview is crumbling because I don't know. You know, there's a bathroom that is non-gender specific or whatever you want to call it, right? And they fall apart over it. Like Europe has had those kind of bathrooms for years, but in America, like people like, is this going to change your life? Is this really going to impact you? Let me tell you that a tax on stock buybacks is going to have a bigger impact on your life than, now, certain people do have something at stake, but most people don't. But because but it comes from religion. It comes from religion. It comes from dogma, religious dogma, and an affront to the dogma. And whether they're religious or not, it comes from religion. And caring about a tax is a little selfish, but caring about the culture. All right, Wes got us over the 650. Thank you for the $100. Really, really appreciate it. He says, this is for excellent Gene Maroney and Rules for Life art beauty shows. Thanks. I appreciate that, and that's great because those shows are the least watched shows that I do. They are. I know some of you, they're your favorites, but particularly the Iran's Rules for Life are the least watched shows that I do. And yet I think in many respects they're the most fun shows, and many of you are shows that are incredibly valued. All right, those are the $20 questions. We'll move on to the $5 and $10 questions. Butte Tapa. I wonder where that's from. Butte, is that like Thai, or it sounds kind of South Asian, Southeast Asian, or something like that. I'm curious. Could adding an each director must be a beneficiary owner clause in the company bylaws pre-IPO backfire on the founder later, bad for hedge funds? I don't know. I'm trying to think where would backfire. I would put it in. I don't know. You'd have to talk to a lawyer about the bylaws, but I would make that a condition of every director I hired. They would have to have a significant amount of money, a significant amount of exposure to the company on which board they are sitting. And how you want to articulate that. Is it a dollar amount? Is it a percentage of their net wealth? Is it probably not a percentage of the company, but it has to be something. So I would definitely consider something like that, and then figure out with a lawyer how you do it in a way that makes the most sense and that won't backfire you in the future. I mean, corporate governance in the United States is completely messed up and screwed up. You know, I could talk about that for hours, but I fear that many of you are so uninterested. Like, why don't the J.P. Morgans of today sit on boards of directors? You know, J.P. Morgan, the great banker of the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, used to sit on a lot of boards, and people, his vice presidents in the bank I think they sat on 200 company boards. Well, one of the things that the 1933-34 Act regulations, I can't remember if the 33 or the 34, did was prohibit bankers from sitting on boards of directors of non-bank companies. They prohibited banks, commercial banks, from owning more than 5% of a non-bank entity. So, and there's so many things like that, insurance companies and pension plans, and who can sit on boards and who can't sit on boards, can and cannot, and who can own and who cannot own, and who should own more and who should own less, that are encoded into our laws. They completely corrupt and distort the process today. It is truly sad. By the way, one of the best ways to deal with ESG, with companies that take ESG seriously, and therefore by doing so destroy shareholder wealth, is to make hostile takeovers easier. Hostile takeovers is another whole thing. I could do 2 shows on hostile takeovers. They're so interesting and so much fun. Again, Other People's Money is the movie to watch for that. And they're so important. But I fear, you guys are not that interested. Or you guys might be, but most people are not. All right, that Doodle Bunny. If you're in 1930s Germany and the Gestapo came to your door to take you to a concentration camp, would you start shooting through the door or hide in your attic like Anna Frank? Well, I mean, it depends, right? Shooting through the door is suicide. There's a point in which suicide is not a bad option, particularly if I can take a bunch of Germans with me. Also, do I have a gun? Am I ready for this? Do I know, for example, particularly if it's the 1930s, which is early, do I know I'm going to a concentration camp? Do I know I'm going to die? I think a lot of people, particularly when the concentration camps started in the late 30s and early 40s, in the very early 40s, weren't sure. They didn't know. And then rumors started. Once the rumors started, there started to be resistance, like the Warsaw Ghetto resistance. You should read about the Warsaw Ghetto resistance. And then they started shooting. But there's nothing wrong with hiding. Hiding in an attic or running into the woods and maybe ultimately picking up arms and fighting. But shooting through the door is suicide. So it's a question of, are you at the point where suicide is the best option? And that's fine. I'd rather commit suicide and kill a bunch of Nazis at the same time than walk peacefully into a gas chamber any day. Right? So, but I think you have to, what path you exactly take is depending on the context and the probability that you'll survive and the kind of life you can and cannot live, and how do you know the fate that awaits you? Roosevelt says, thank you, Ron, for a great show. I do enjoy your shows about economics and financial markets. Good. And I'll keep doing them. I'm just bitching a little bit. That's okay. James Taylor asks, when you were debating Fabian liberty, all right, why did you keep using the phrase anarcho-capitalism? It's anarchy. There's no such thing as anarcho-capitalism. Yeah, I agree. And I said there's no such thing in the debate. I said there's no such thing as anarcho-capitalism. There's only anarchy and there's capitalism, and the two are mutually exclusive. And I actually said that when I talked to him. I don't remember using the term anarcho-capitalism, and if I did, my mistake, my error. It's a horrible term because it gives the assumption that there is such a thing and there isn't such a thing. There's no such thing as anything capitalism. There's no such thing as conscious capitalism. There's no such thing as, I don't know, anything capitalism. Crony capitalism doesn't exist. There's cronyism and there's capitalism. There's anarchy and there's capitalism. And they're opposites. They're not the same thing. Michael says, is there enough implicit egoism in people's heads keeping altruistic policies at a limit? Yes, for now. Ultimately, the more altruism gets entrenched, the less it's questioned, the weaker that implicit egoism is. Liam asks, Atlas Shrugged predicted this century of looters. It sure did. God. Megan asks, can you interview Bud Bingham on Ria's business? That would be fun. I'll talk to Bud about doing that. That would be a lot of fun. Andy says, happy to catch a live show while on vacation, enjoying catching up with past shows like the Peterson-Dugan, voting for future philosophy reviews. Yeah, I mean, if you've got ideas on who you'd like me to analyze, I'm happy to do it, or happy to try to do it, right? I keep need to remind everybody I'm not a philosopher. So it has to be within my wheelhouse. Dugan is easy. He's so ridiculous, it's easy, right? If you're an anarchist, you're not a capitalist. You're not pro-capitalist. Sorry. You're a walking contradiction. And people do that. People are walking contradictions in all kinds of realms of life. All right, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. We reached our goal. I'm surprised. I didn't think we'll make it. I think Shahzad got us going there with like $250, and then a bunch of you piled in. And that was great. Wes came in with 100, and that got us over the hump, and that's fantastic. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Tomorrow, what is the title of the show tomorrow? I'll tell you what the title of the show is. I think it's going to be an interesting show. It's got this kind of cultural aspect, so maybe somebody will come and watch it, but maybe they don't even know what it's about. So it's called Land Acknowledgements. Do you know what land acknowledgements are? You're supposed to acknowledge the fact that the land you're living on, or the land you're working on, or the land you're harvesting once belonged to other people, and it was taken away, stolen from them. And now in some universities, you're supposed to, as part of, I don't know, the groveling you do once a year to the powers to be, as long as your general guilt trip of the guilt, you're supposed to acknowledge the fact that this land is stolen land. So we'll talk about land acknowledgements, but we'll talk about kind of the tricky issue of how to think about colonialism, how to think about, the slaughter of the American Indians and the slaughter, in some cases, of other colony native populations in different colonies. The East India Company is probably responsible for the deaths of millions and millions of Indians. They starved them to death because of their policies. So how do we think of those things? What do they fall under? Is it an injustice? Should we today feel guilty for what happened back then? Is this a blemish on capitalism? All of that we'll talk about tomorrow. I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's, should we pay reparations, for example? Or should we just say sorry? What should we do? How do we think about it? Do we just say it was an immense injustice? Or do we not even say that? Do we say, who cares, right? So I've got a view. I don't know if it's an objectivist view, but it's my view about how to deal with past grievances or some of these past issues. I think it's interesting. It's worth talking about. So we'll talk about that in the context of this university professor who's been sanctioned for not willing to participate in this charade of land acknowledgements. He wouldn't write a land acknowledgement. So we'll talk about that. That's a cultural issue. Maybe people are interested. We'll see. All right. Again, thank you all for being here. Don't forget, if you want to support the show, don't forget to, Jeffrey, thank you for the support. I just noticed that. Jeffrey chipped in, thank you. You can support me monthly on Patreon or Subscribestar. Those are great. You can also do it on YaronBrookShow.com/support, although that website is a little clinky. And of course, thank you to all the super chatters. And I will see you all tomorrow at 8 p.m. And then we'll talk about tomorrow about what happens in California and how often are we going to do shows and at what times and stuff like that. We'll see. See you tomorrow. Bye.